In this episode, we're going to be covering our income-based channels of flow. We'll start with reflex giving, then we'll cover heartbeat giving, and end this episode with streamlined giving. So, Keelan, give us the definition of reflex giving.
So, as we think about how our resources move from our control, reflex giving is quick, simple, spontaneous generosity, often in response to some kind of immediate need, often involving cash or some cash equivalent like actual physical possessions. If you think back to our domain series, we covered 4 broad domains. Domain 2 is everyday generosity, and this is a perfect match for reflex giving. Everyday generosity is responding to immediate needs. Now, in domain, we're talking about the focus areas of giving, where that giving is going. In flow, when we talk about reflex giving, we're talking about how the resources move. But those two are a perfect match and go along well together.
Yeah, this also brings to mind from our motivation series, Joyful Givers. I think a lot of joyful givers enjoy this type of giving because you often get to see people face to face.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think this is a huge strength of joyful givers. They really excel in this kind of responsive giving. In addition to giving directly to people, reflex giving could involve responding on the spot to some kind of call to action. I think about an example I might have shared earlier in another episode about attending a campus ministry conference in college, and there was a call to action to respond through giving towards the end of the conference. That was one of my first relatively big gifts, at least in proportion to what I had as a college student. And that's also a great example of reflex giving, seeing an opportunity in front of you and just responding in that moment.
Some of the benefits of reflex giving are that it's flexible, it's quick, and it's simple to execute. There's a low barrier to entry. It can be, just like you described, an immediate response to a call to action. A few years back, I was at a Christian concert and a ministry presented, and a bunch of people pulled out their wallets and gave in response. That's an example of a bunch of people engaging in reflex giving.
Yeah, and I think especially when you contrast reflex giving to some of the later types of giving, especially some of the asset channels of giving that we're going to talk about, which involve often weeks or months of planning, working through a lot of different kind of dimensions of considerations. It really highlights the power of reflex giving, which is getting those resources out the door fast into where they need to go. Now, some of the limitations of reflex giving have to do with that same quality. For one, you lose the potential of ongoing partnership and relationship. When I think through relational givers, going back to motivation, a lot of that depth in relationship comes from giving and partnering over time. And you miss a lot of that with reflex giving, which is usually kind of a one time on the spot event. It's also harder to allocate your giving intentionally when most of your giving is on the spot without any preconceived kind of buckets for where you're planning on your giving going throughout the year. Then it's hard to say where most of your giving will end up until most of your giving is done. When you have a little bit more of a plan in place beforehand, you can better allocate and divide up where most of your giving is going to go. And that can often leave space still for reflex giving. But this is where you get some of the drawbacks.
Now, one powerful tool I've found for reflex giving is anonymous giving. And as I've thought through this more, there are actually several reasons why we might give anonymously versus openly. But let's explore this a little bit more.
Yeah, you can give anonymously through any of the channels of flow, but I think it's especially powerful within this realm of reflex giving. When we give anonymously, I think one of the first things I think of about anonymous giving is that it helps us understand our motives. Whenever I give, I can find myself wondering, why am I really making this gift? My wife and I have even had these conversations together when we've given. And when you give anonymously, it really clarifies your motives. You're really giving to bless the recipient. And while you may get an intrinsic feeling of joy, going back to our joyful givers, that doesn't have to do with somebody's approval of you.
Yeah, it also clarifies your motives for the recipient. I think a lot of us as givers have struggled through well, how is this person going to use the gift that I've given them? And when you give anonymously, you are completely trusting and releasing the recipient to use that gift as they see fit.
In that same vein, I think it also bypasses some level of uneasiness. There are lots of stories of people being very grateful for a sudden spontaneous gift that comes out of nowhere. But there's also some stories of people feeling awkward about receiving a gift. When you give anonymously, it actually frees them up from any expectation of certain kind of gratitude or performance in how they receive it. So in many ways, that can actually be more freeing for the recipient.
Another benefit of anonymous giving is that it makes for great stories. Each of us have already shared some examples of anonymous giving in our own lives, but even small, simple gifts done anonymously make a lasting impression for the giver.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, it redirects the glory to God. I can think of different people in my life who have received anonymous gifts, and when they've told me about it, the whole conversation is different because it's an anonymous gift. They really see that as a blessing from God Himself. We know from James 1 that every good and perfect gift is from God, but it's much easier to see and feel that when it's anonymous. When it comes from a person, then it can be easy to forget that ultimately this gift came from God.
There are a couple scriptures that kind of support that point. The one that comes to mind is 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 12, where Paul is encouraging the church in Corinth to live generously. It says, "This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, others will praise God."
Now, we talked a little bit about why anonymous giving can be so powerful. What are your thoughts about giving openly?
Yeah, this is actually something that comes up quite a bit. We've had several discussions around giving anonymously versus openly. And I think giving openly is different than giving publicly. We see Jesus talk about giving publicly in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's encouraging his followers not to announce their giving on the street corners because they've already received their reward, right? And I think the difference between giving publicly and openly goes back to the motive. When we give publicly, we are trying to generate attention for ourselves. We want the glory. But when we give openly, it's more about identifying ourselves, which actually opens us up to partnership and relationship.
Yeah, that is a great distinction. I think about some of the stories of givers that we have heard who have led the way in an entire movement through their giving. One example that comes to mind is the whole Illuminations Impact Alliance. That alliance, which has united most of the major Bible translation organizations, was launched by givers. It was launched by givers saying, we want to do something greater than giving to any one organization. We want to unite this entire movement to complete the work of making the Bible available in every language. And we've talked through many different nuances and aspects of bringing that partnership together. It could not have happened if it was not led by givers, but it has drastically changed the Bible translation movement. That is the value of open giving. And as you said, very different than public giving. It's about inviting others into something.
Giving openly also allows us to partner directly with organizations. And while there are some reasons that people choose to give anonymously to organizations, I actually enjoy connecting with and getting updates from the ministries that I give to. And I get a sense that we're partnering together rather than just me writing a check.
And on another angle, I think there's also a level of accountability when we give openly. When the recipient knows where the gift is coming from, especially with an organization, there's, a healthy level of responsibility. You and I have both been a part of nonprofits ourselves, and I know that whenever we have received a gift, there is a deep gratitude that I feel and a healthy weight of responsibility. I want to honor that giver because of how they have trusted us with that gift, and I want to do well because of that partnership. That all comes from open giving and relationships with givers.
The benefits of open giving can also apply when we give to individuals. I'm part of a Bible study that freely gives out Bibles to new attendees who don't have their own Bible. And it's a very personalized experience where their name is written on the Bible and it's dedicated and given by a specific individual who paid for that. And that actually builds relationship between individuals.
The final thing I think of is inspiring generosity in others. As we've shared before, long before Applied Generosity, we were hosting the Finish Line podcast where we have been able to speak to hundreds of givers who have shared their stories. And I cannot tell you at this point how many times I have heard people reach out and say, thank you so much for sharing this story or that story of this giver. This directly spoke into something I've been working through, or it directly led to me taking this giant leap of faith in some way. That is because those givers were generous with their stories and openly shared about how generosity has moved and impacted their lives. And you miss some of that if everything is kept inside. Now, when we think about these two dynamics, giving anonymously and giving openly, I often think back to the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And that seems to line up very well with all this open giving that we're talking about. Others seeing and wanting to be invited in, wanting to emulate in their own lives, all of this good stuff. But then just a handful of verses later, he says, and when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And that seems to be pretty clearly talking about anonymous giving, so much so that even those closest to you might not even know about it. So which is it? Should we give openly or give anonymously? How do you think through that balance?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the motivation of your heart. In Matthew chapter 6, we also see Jesus talk about praying and fasting in secret. But I think as a church, we're actually much more comfortable talking about those things. We pray in public constantly. We see Jesus take time to celebrate the faith of the widow who gave her last two copper coins, and at the same time condemn the Pharisees for giving in a way that directs attention to them. I've come to realize over time that the verse that you mentioned from Matthew chapter 5, let your light shine before others, we are not the source of the light. We are letting the light shine through us. And when we take that posture, that it's not about, look at me, look what I've done, look how good of a person I am, it instead gives people an opportunity to invite Jesus into their own life so that they might let him shine through them as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most helpful ways to look through these two passages, which can look like they conflict with each other. Now, we've talked about a lot of benefits of both anonymous and open giving. And another kind of pattern that has been helpful for me is that in general, anonymous giving will tend to be most helpful when giving to individuals. When I think back through some of the strengths that we talked about in anonymous giving, understanding your motives, clarifying the motives for the recipient, bypassing uneasiness, creating great stories, and redirecting the glory, a lot of these are most felt when you are giving to an individual rather than an organization. On the flip side, a lot of the benefits we talked about in open giving, like unifying others around a cause, fostering partnerships with a recipient, creating accountability, and inspiring generosity in others, most of those are most strongly felt when giving to an organization. And so I wouldn't say those are black and white rules of giving, by no means. And there are all kinds of examples where you might give openly with an individual or anonymously to an organization. But I think that's a helpful kind of broad framework as you try to sort through some of this in your own life.
Now, our second channel of income based giving is what we call heartbeat giving, which is characterized by reliable, committed, steady generosity that communicates we're in this together for the long haul.
Yeah, when I think of heartbeat giving, a classic example that comes to mind is our giving through domain one, if you think back to the four major domains, and that's the local church. That's actually probably a very common starting point for many givers, is this regular weekly giving to whatever local expression of the church you're a part of. Now, the other major example that comes to mind is giving steadily and consistently with a nonprofit over a long period of time. And like we talked about when we were talking about open giving, that steady long term giving helps foster a sense of partnership or relationship with an organization where you feel like in a real tangible way you are a part of the work that is happening on the ground.
Yeah, some of the benefits of heartbeat giving are that it's predictable for the giver and the recipient. It helps us to form strong partnerships. It often leads to greater long term impact, and it gives us an opportunity to be in the yoke together with workers on the field. This kind of giving is the heartbeat that sustains God's handiwork all over the world. Not because he needs us or our money, but because he's chosen to work through us to accomplish his purposes, to restore the earth, and to see the gospel proclaimed in every tribe, tongue, and nation.
Yeah, I think back here to our relational givers who are all about that partnership with others towards a common goal. I also think of compassion givers who are drawn into deeper and deeper connection with a given cause or a certain group of people that are being served. This kind of heartbeat giving deepens that connection over time and encourages us to explore how we can engage further. We talked about this in our intervention series about wanting to grow from idealism to actually understanding are the interventions that we're using actually having meaningful impact. That comes from being engaged over a long period of time.
I think most givers are probably familiar with reflex giving and heartbeat giving and maybe engaged in both of those already. But what do we mean when we talk about streamlined giving?
Streamlined giving has to do with leveraging financial wisdom, strategies, and tools to multiply your capacity for generosity. And this can be a really cool channel for some givers. We have heard stories of givers increasing their giving capacity by over 50% using certain tools without actually parting with any more dollars. This kind of giving is a natural draw for strategists who are always looking to multiply the effect of resources. And a lot of that multiplication comes from understanding how our giving interacts with the tax code. Now, I don't think tax deductions are a great motivation for giving. There are so many deeper motivations for generosity that have nothing to do with taxes, and that's not what's going to sustain you for the long haul. However, if you are already giving at your maximum capacity, there may be ways to multiply the effect of those resources in how you give them. That's where streamlined giving comes into play. So I know you work with clients all the time and often with a lot of these streamlined strategies. How do you know when you're ready for streamlined giving?
Yeah, I think there are strategies that could apply for any giver, but you're going to have the most opportunities to be tax efficient with your giving when you itemize your deductions when you file your taxes.
And what does that mean to itemize your deductions?
Yeah, so basically, when we file our personal taxes, we're making the choice between the standard deduction or itemizing our deductions. And the standard deduction is an amount that's determined by the IRS each year that we can use to basically reduce our taxable income. For individuals and families who have a lot of deductions, which include charitable giving, they might actually benefit from itemizing, which means listing out each deduction individually. And if that number is large enough, it might be more tax efficient to use your itemized list rather than take the standard deduction.
So basically, in simple terms, if you're giving at a high enough level that it makes sense to itemize your deductions when you file your taxes, then you're going to get the most benefit from giving in certain ways that are tax efficient.
Now, for many givers, especially those who are at the point of itemizing their deductions, there's a tool that exists called a donor advised fund that can be very helpful to organize and streamline your giving. And I'll just take a moment to explain how donor advised funds work. Once you have it set up at a donor advised fund sponsor, you add cash or assets to your donor advised fund. And since it's owned by a 501c3, you get the tax benefit right away of your gift. So the cash or your assets go into the donor advised fund, And then you have the option of granting it to one or multiple 501(c)(3)s or to invest it within your donor advised fund. So the process of getting a tax deduction and actually deploying the resources are separated. Because the timing of your giving is flexible, it opens up some new strategies for our giving. And we won't be able to cover all of those in this episode, but a well informed financial advisor should be well suited to talk through some of those. Some common benefits of using a donor advised fund are that it helps you to manage your gift receipts when you file your taxes. When you handle your giving to 501(c)(3)s through a donor advised fund, you only have to track down one receipt for the gifts that you've made in the previous year. Donor advised funds also allow you to give anonymously to organizations. Now, you can't give directly to individuals through a donor advised fund, but they do maintain that option for anonymity. This tool also helps you for handling windfalls. Sometimes we receive a lump sum. You already know that you're not going to spend it on yourself, which frees you up to give it, but you may not have decided where you want to grant those funds. So putting that money into a donor advised fund helps you separate your finances and get the tax deduction today while you're deciding how to deploy those resources. Donor advised funds also are very well suited to receive non-cash gifts, which could be any number of appreciated assets. But not all organizations are set up themselves to receive those types of gifts. And finally, if you choose to invest within your donor advised fund, which we'll talk in more detail about in our next series, the investments within your donor advised fund actually grow tax-free because they are technically owned by a 501(c)(3).
So let's walk through a quick example here because I think there's a lot of power behind a lot of this strategy. Let's say you purchased a stock years ago for $5,000. Now it's worth $20,000. And now you want to donate the value of that stock to a ministry. And for this example, we'll say you're in the 40% tax bracket once you include federal and state taxes altogether. Now, there's a couple ways you could go about this. Without using any of this strategy that we're talking about, you could simply sell the stock for $20,000 and then give the proceeds to whatever ministry you're trying to support. That would be how lots of people would go about this process. However, because that stock has appreciated a lot, it's grown $15,000 over the years, you're going to pay capital gains tax on all of that gain. In this case, that might come out to $3,000 or so, and that's a hefty chunk of what you're trying to give. Now, an alternative strategy using a donor advised fund would be to take your $20,000 in stock and actually move the stock into your donor advised fund. Then, once it's in there, sell the stock. Since it is now owned by a nonprofit already, which is your donor advised fund, you don't pay any capital gains tax and you get that full $20,000 to give. Also, since you're now able to give the full $20,000 instead of $17,000 in that first example, you're going to get a larger income tax deduction because you're making a larger gift of $20,000 instead of $17,000. In our first example, where you sell the stock and then give away the proceeds, you're going to save about $6,800 in income tax. That's just the tax deduction you get for making a cash gift of $17,000. In our second example, where you move the stock into your donor advised fund, then sell it, and then give that full value to the nonprofit, first of all, the nonprofit is going to get $20,000 instead of $17,000. And you are going to save $11,000 instead of $6,800. And this is all with the same stock. So both the nonprofit gets more in the end, and you will save significantly more in the end. And if you've already decided that you don't need any of this stock for your own family's provision and needs, then you can go ahead and give what you saved on your tax deductions away as well, and even further multiply what you're able to give. So you can see how simply making that one change can dramatically multiply what you're able to give. Now, if you're with me so far, let's take it one layer deeper and say, what if you're not ready to sell that stock It's been doing well. Obviously, it's grown 4 times in value over the years, and you want to hold on to it. Well, there's actually another way to do this where you can still keep that stock. So let's go through our first example. So let's say you want to give away $20,000 and you have this $20,000 in stock that has grown. You could simply give away $20,000 in cash and hold on to the stock. That would be what most people would do. Or you can do what we just talked about, move your stock over to your donor advised fund and then give through your donor advised fund with all the tax implications that has, saving you more on your taxes and getting more to the nonprofit. And then with the $20,000 in cash that you were considering giving, buy back the same stock. Now, in the end, you still have the stock and it can continue to grow, but you've already captured all of those tax gains. We like to call that strategy the cost basis reset. And we've heard a few very well tuned financial advisors give that strategy over the years. This is all the power of what we call streamlined giving.
So we've covered reflex giving, heartbeat giving, and streamlined giving as income-based channels of flow in this episode. In our next episode, we're going to talk about channels of asset giving. Stay tuned.